First of all, as we've pointed out, this Ritvik representative system allowed Srila Prabhupada to continue to accept disciples without requiring his physical presence or involvement at all in the initiation process. And as I pointed out, the GBC accept that this process is, well, or at least in their view, was fully bona fide as long as his divine grace remained physically present. Once he was no longer physically present, then the GBC claimed that the entire process became bogus. All right, now let me see if let me try to get this straight. Srila Prabhupada set up a system by which he could accept new disciples without the need for his physical presence. And the GBC accept that Ritvik process was fully bona fide, but only as long as Srila Prabhupada was physically present. So as soon as Srila Prabhupada was no longer physically present, then the system that no longer required his physical presence became invalid. Does anyone else see the humor in such logic? The system that no longer requires Srila Prabhupada's physical presence is bona fide only as long as he is physically present. Well, look, it's really not as confusing or as bad as that sounds, right? I mean, that is right? Wait, okay, let me explain further to try and clear this up. Srila Prabhupada set up a system by which he can accept new disciples, and yet he need not be physically present or involved. And the GBC agrees. They agree that he didn't have to be physically present. Well, at least not in the same temple room. They agree that he doesn't have to be physically present in the same building. They agree that he doesn't have to be in the same city or the same province or state or the same country or even on the same continent. Once Srila Prabhupada had authorized the Ritvik representatives, Srila Prabhupada could be laying very weak in his bed in Vrindavan, India, that he can't even sit up on his own, and so weak he could barely speak. And yet via this Ritvik representative system, via the Ritvik representatives, he can be initiating new disciples in North America, South America, Africa, New Zealand, Japan, Europe, the Middle East, South India, Bengal, Russia, China, Mauritius, etc., without any need for his physical presence there or his physical involvement at all in the process. And still, the GBC was totally okay with that, as long as he was physically present, as long as he was physically somewhere else on this earth planet. But what if he were no longer physically present on this planet? According to the GBC, that is what causes the process to denigrate from being totally bona fide to becoming totally and completely deviant and bogus. Well, how is that? Because according to the GBC, as soon as Srila Prabhupada is no longer physically present on this earthly planet, the system he authorizes will lose its spiritual potency. Well, how is that? Well, it appears that the GBC is saying that as long as Srila Prabhupada is physically present in his Vapu form somewhere on this earthly planet, then the proxy initiations by the Ritvik representatives has all spiritual potency and is fully bona fide. But as soon as Srila Prabhupada is no longer present in his Vapu form somewhere on this planet, it then loses all of its spiritual potency. Odd, Srila Prabhupada in his July 9th letter never mentioned this. In fact, in all of his teachings in the Vedic scriptures, I don't recall ever seeing that the spiritual potency of the Guru exists only while that Guru is present in his Vapu form, somewhere in this world. But it seems that this must be the foundation of the GBC's logic. Now, just to throw out some wild what-ifs. What if Srila Prabhupada was still present with us, but he goes up in the space station in his Vapu form? Well, would he no longer be physically present on this planet within the Earth's atmosphere? So would that make the proxy system of initiations he set up still lose all its spiritual potency? Or would it remain valid and spiritually potent? For the sake of argument, let's assume that the GBC would accept that it would still remain valid because Srila Prabhupada would still be living in his earthly Vapu form. Well, what if, since we are just throwing out wild what ifs, what if this were in the future and somehow earthly humans were able to travel to the moon or to Mars in our earthly bodies? What if Srila Prabhupada, while in his earthly Vapu form, went and traveled to another planet? Would the process no longer be valid because his temporary Vapu form was no longer physically present on this planet? Or would it still be valid because Srila Prabhupada was still residing in his earthly Vapu form, even though that form may be on a different planet? Well, this is getting a little more complex and interesting, but remember, the system that Srila Prabhupada had authorized allows him to accept new disciples without requiring his physical involvement or his physical presence. He could be lying in Vrindavan, practically even unconscious for days at a time, in such a weak condition, unable to walk, barely speak, and yet via this Ritvik representative process, he can be accepting disciples all over the world without being physically involved and without being physically present in those locations. The entire physical aspects of the process was delegated to the Ritvik representative system. And yet the GBC accept that that system was fully bona fide. So what if Srila Prabhupada was no longer physically on this planet, but still in his Vapu form? I mean, it's a good question. If the GBC rejects it and says such initiations would no longer be valid, then why? What would be the basis of that? That he isn't just physically present? Well, he wasn't physically present in, say, New York when he was lying in his bed in Vrindavan. Yet he could still accept disciples via the Ritvik representative system. Why, if his Vapu form is on the moon planet, would it make any real difference? Okay, let's assume that the GBC do agree and say, yes, the Ritvik representative system would still be bona fide because Srila Prabhupada was still residing in his Vapu form. But what if Srila Prabhupada goes to another planet like Goloka Vrindavan, where his Vapu form is no longer required? Will the Ritvik process of initiation still be spiritually bona fide? Well, the GBC have been arguing no. If he is no longer in his Vapu form, then it loses all of its spiritual potency. The point I am making is what actually empowered or empowers the Ritvik representative system of initiation that Srila Prabhupada authorized. What gave it its spiritual potency? What is it that makes or made it actually bona fide? And then what determines that it has lost its spiritual potency? The GBC argue that it was bona fide only when Srila Prabhupada was present, even though he didn't have to be physically present in the same room, same building, same city, same state, same country, or even on the same continent. But then what if he's not on the same planet? So maybe the GBC will agree, yes, fine, he can be on Mars, he can be on the moon planet, as long as he's still in his Vapu form. But what if he were on Krishna's planet Goloka Vrindavan? Would the system still be valid? Well, would it or not? Because as far as we know, and both sides agree, this is actually where Srila Prabhupada is currently residing. But the GBC have been arguing, even if he's residing in Goloka Vrindavan, it would no longer be a spiritually potent process because he wasn't in his Vapu earthly form anymore. Therefore, the GBC are arguing that it is the Vapu form of the Guru which provides the spiritual potency for making such initiations bona fide. This line of logic concludes that when Srila Prabhupada leaves his temporary Vapu form, that his spiritual potency also dries up, and that he can no longer give spiritual initiations, that he has lost the spiritual potency to do so. Following this logic then, Srila Prabhupada's potency to give spiritual initiations wasn't empowered through his spiritual life force, which is eternal, nor was it empowered according to their logic by his eternal teachings, but they are claiming that his spiritual potency to give spiritual initiations was 100% contained within his Vapu form. And once that form ceases to live in this world, Srila Prabhupada's spiritual potency had dried up and died with it. When Srila Prabhupada's earthly Vapu form was lying physically weak in his bed in Gokul Vrindavan, unable to even sit up and hardly able to speak, even unconscious at times, the process remained fully bona fide. But now that Srila Prabhupada is dancing with Krishna in Goloka Vrindavan, the very same exact process has lost all of its spiritual potency and has become totally bogus. It all just died with his Vapu form when his Vapu form ceased living in this world. This would mean that the GBC's philosophy as to what gave this Ritvik representative system of initiations its spiritual potency was not Srila Prabhupada's spiritual life force, which is eternal, nor his eternal spiritual instructions, his Vani, but rather they claim what gave him his spiritual potency was his temporary Vapu form. Okay, I'm off script a little for a minute because I just wanted to re-emphasize the point, which I think I've made clear, but I just want to re-emphasize it. That the basis of the GBC's philosophy, when you analyze it, when you deductively analyze what really is the basis of their philosophy on this, that basis, that is what is apasiddhanta. It goes against the principles of religion. It is a bogus and it is a deviant philosophy. Everything that they have been accusing the Ritvik representative of the Acharya system to be is actually, in fact, what their position is by opposing the system. Srila Prabhupada had empowered a system by which initiations he could continue to take disciples without his physical presence or physical involvement. It no longer required his Vapu form to be physically present at the location. It no longer required his Vapu form to be involved in any aspect at all. So whether Srila Prabhupada is residing in that Vapu form or not makes no difference as to the system that he had authorized being spiritually potent. And to argue that it has lost its spiritual potency because he's no longer residing in his Vapu form, earthly Vapu form, is a bogus and goes against the principles of Scripture that we understand who a spiritual master, a bona fide spiritual master, a bona fide Shakti Vaishya avatar, a bona fide representative of Krishna really is. And it is spiritual potency did not come from residing in his Vapu form. Again, the basis of the GBC's philosophy regarding this Ritvik system is that Srila Prabhupada's earthly presence within his earthly Vapu form is what spiritually empowered his giving of initiation. I call this the Vapu Vada philosophy. And those who uphold this, I refer to them as the Vapu Vadis. The word Vapu, of course, refers to the temporary bodily form of the spiritual master. And the word Vada means philosophy. Veda is knowledge, and Vada means a philosophy. Vadi is a person who upholds a certain Vada, or a certain philosophy. The GBC have been upholding this Vapu Vada philosophy for decades now. The GBC agree that the 100% the 100% proxy system via the Ritvik representatives was bona fide from July 9th, 1977 up until 7:20 p.m. local Vrindavan time on November 14th of 1977, which they claim at that point the system had lost all of its spiritual potency. Why? Because, according to them, Srila Prabhupada's temporary earthly Vapu form had ceased living on this planet, and therefore, along with it, all the spiritual potency for him to give initiation died with it. That is the only difference between before November 14th at 7:20 p.m. and after that date and time. However, there are many followers of Srila Prabhupada who love Srila Prabhupada very, very much, who are intelligent, knowledgeable of the principles of Vedic thought, who totally disagree with this totally bogus and apasiddhanta basis of the philosophy that the GBC has been preaching for so many decades. This Vapuvada philosophy is a grave deviation. It is apasiddhanta. It goes against the transcendental scriptures and the transcendental teachings of the past acharyas. Such bogus Vapuvada philosophy must be rejected and ran out of Srila Prabhupada's ISKCON mission. There is no place in Srila Prabhupada's mission for such a bogus and deviant Vapuvada philosophy. It is devoid of scriptural basis. It is mundane. It is offensive. It assumes that Srila Prabhupada's potency to give spiritual initiation resided only in his living Vapu form. It is wrong. It must be completely rejected by those who consider themselves followers of Srila Prabhupada. Yet for decades, this has been the very basis of the GBC's stand on this issue. On the other side, we, the supporters of the ongoing Ritvik representative system, we understand that the temporary Vapu form is not what empowered the proxy form of initiations or any other valid form of spiritual initiations given by Srila Prabhupada or any of the past acharyas. What empowers the spiritual system of the initiation was and still is Srila Prabhupada's transcendental eternal Vani, his spiritual and eternal teachings, his instructions, which vibrantly live within the heart of his true followers. This is what empowered this Ritvik system of initiation while his earthly Vapu form was living and breathing in his bed in Gokul Vrindavan. And it is what continues to empower this system even now when he is dancing with Lord Krishna in Goloka Vrindavan in his eternal spiritual form. Srila Prabhupada's spiritual life force, which is eternal, as is all of our souls, and his Vani is what spiritually empowers the Ritvik representative process. And as long as there are followers who take shelter of his eternal Vani, this process remains as valid today as it did on July 9th, 1977 to November 14th of 1977. Srila Prabhupada's Vani didn't expire or die. His spiritual potency didn't expire or die when he left, when his temporary earthly Vapu form ceased breathing. Therefore, this process remains as 100%, as vividly alive and spiritually valid and potent and bona fide today as it did while his Vapu form was still breathing. Because his spiritual Vani and spiritual potency was and is not dependent on the breath of the temporary Vapu form. It is time to turn the tables. It is time to establish real Siddhanta and kick out this bogus Vapuvada philosophy that has been pervaded ISKCON and the GBC for decades. The GBC must come to terms with this and do the right thing. They must reverse their stand on this issue and realize that the Vapuvada philosophy, which they have been upholding and promoting for decades, is totally bogus. It is what is apasiddhanta. It goes against the principles of religion, of our scripture. The Ritvik process of initiation was and still empowered by Srila Prabhupada's eternal Vani, his internal instructions of his divine grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Over the years, I have given this argument many times to a number of devotees who reject the ongoing Ritvik Ras path. And not once has anyone ever attempted to debate this argument and the logic with me. Rather, when I give this argument and present my logic to those who reject the Ritvik Ras path, every single time those devotees would just not address this argument at all. They tried to introduce an entirely different argument. Oh, what about this? Oh, what about that? And they tried to evade having to confront this argument. Not one single devotee who opposed the Ritvik Ras, whom I presented this to, not one has ever attempted to address this point, which means they are the fanatic. The Vapuvadis, who uphold this Vapuvada philosophy and insist that Srila Prabhupada lost all his spiritual potency to give such initiations via a Ritvik system, because that potency just resides only in his Vapu form, and it no longer is living today. That is, those devotees, not one of them has addressed this issue. That is a totally deviant and bogus philosophy, and that is what needs to be kicked out of Srila Prabhupada's mission. It is poisonous. When one side presents an argument and the other side cannot dispute it, then by all accepted rules of civilized debates, they are defeated. Fanatics refuse to accept defeat when they are confronted with a superior logic or knowledge that goes against their sentimental feelings. The sentimental ideas of those who reject the ongoing Ritvik system are actually based on this bogus Vapuvada philosophy.